switch to my Puerto Rico coffee mug instead of my Camden County Services for the Aging mug in honor of this conversation. That's all.
Perfect. Perfect. Well, thank you to everyone who has joined and those who are going to jump on shortly. It's great to see folks and to gather here. And I'm really excited to be joined by some wonderful folks and panelists here. Christian, I was going to introduce you all, but I feel like it's actually nice to let panelists introduce themselves. Christian, do you want to kick us off? Tell us a little bit about yourself and where you are joining us from.
So my name is Christian Mercado. I am joining you from Ithaca, New York. I run a podcast called the Food Engineer Podcast that serves as a science communication arm of my work as a brewing consultant. My background is in industrial engineering and in food science, specialized in beer. But I did decide to take this route to educate the Spanish-speaking population more about craft beverages and fermented foods and beverages overall.
Very cool. Thank you. Anaïs, do you want to tell us about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Anaïs LeCoq. I'm joining you from France right now. I'm actually on vacation in the Alps, but I live in Reims, Champagne region, but I'm moving soon in Brittany, so cider region. It's gonna be a cool change. So I'm a freelance journalist, beer writer, and author. I've always been a journalist. I worked for 6-7 years in for local newspapers, and then I left, and now I'm freelancing. And I focus on beer, French beer culture, and history. There's lots of things to say about that, and I'm sharing it in both language, English and French.
Excellent, thank you. And last but certainly not least, Miguel, tell us about yourself and where you're joining us from.
My name is Miguel Rivas. I'm a photographer based in New York, when I'm in New York. Today I'm from Madrid, Spain, and I have a project that I started 10 years ago called the Beer Trekker. So I put together 3 things that I'm passionate about: photography, traveling, and beer. I've been traveling around the world, visiting breweries and documenting it with pictures and stories and telling the stories of the people behind the beer. In 2015 was my first trip to Latin America, Central America. I went to Costa Rica to start learning about what's happening in the region. And for the last 8 years, I've been traveling all the way from Mexico all the way down to Argentina. Documenting the beer culture.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone, literally globally joining us. Very cool. Thanks for being here. And thanks for introducing yourselves. I guess just to kick off, I'll let whoever of our panelists wants to jump in here. But for those of you for whom, can you just tell each of us, could each of you tell us how you came to speak the languages that you speak? Did you study them in school? Did you grow up in a household where they were spoken? Just give us a little bit of background on how you came to speak the languages that you do.
Who wants to start? I can start. Yeah, well, English, I learned it at school. At first with German, I took both. But I think it's mostly by watching TV shows and movies in English that helped me really be fluent in English more than study at school and high school. I have always liked talking in English, but at school it was quite boring to learn the language. So yeah, it's mostly thanks to watching way too much TV shows that it helped me speak and read and write in English.
Can I ask which TV shows you were watching to learn, or which ones are your favorites to learn?
I don't know. It was when I was a teenager, so I think mostly teen shows. But I really remember the first movie I watched in English with subtitles, and it was Hot Fuzz. Maybe you know it. It's from I can't remember the name of the filmmaker. He also did Shaun of the Dead and things like that. So yeah, it was the first movie that I watched in English and not in the French version. And since then, since this movie, I watched everything in English.
Awesome. I love that. That's so cool. Miguel, why don't you go next?
Okay. Well, I was born in the United States, but I grew up in Venezuela. My family is from Venezuela. So when we moved back to Venezuela, I guess just by being there, and also in the household, my parents will speak for the most part English. That's a very common thing with Latin Americans who live in the United States. They want to raise their kids speaking English, which now that I'm older and a parent, I feel that that's awful because you are not letting your kids learn their another language. Well, thankfully, that is kind of changing a little bit now. Back in the day, it was more a thing of a stigma that people who were not from the country didn't want their kids to have like an accent. Like I have an accent. And, I have no planning, no plans on changing that. I was always really proud of that. So that's how I got to speak Spanish. And I grew up there, and I moved back to the States when I was 20. So that's another thing that people from Venezuela, when they left Venezuela almost 30 years ago, and when I speak to any Venezuelan, that's the first thing they say. It's like, "Oh, you haven't lost your accent." I'm like, "No, and I never will, because I never made any effort to change that." And also, after I came here, I also learned how to speak Portuguese, which came in handy because a couple of months ago I went down to Brazil for a month and a half, and my Portuguese was a little rusty, but I made myself just speak Portuguese while I was there. And it was I was proud that speaking to native Portuguese speakers and me trying to explain things and just talk about beer things, that they will tell me, like, where did you learn? Like, you have so much vocabulary, and you're telling me all the things that are wrong with my beer in Portuguese. How are you doing that? So I was proud that it paid off.
That's awesome. Yeah, communicating beer flaws in another language, impressive. Christian, tell us a little bit about your background here.
So I grew up speaking Spanish, did take English throughout school. It's mandatory in Puerto Rico, and always had a pretty hard time speaking conversationally because I didn't really use it until I moved to Virginia for a consulting job where communication is a big deal, and not having an accent was kind of necessary. So I still have an accent, but sometimes I try to hide it. Kind of related to what Miguel was talking about, right? It's your accent is in a certain way defines you and tells a story about how you got to where you are. I also had a big interest in Italian when I was in college. Uh, Different hobby. I was doing a lot of spear fishing, and that's where they produce a lot of the best equipment. So I decided to learn Italian, and I traveled there. So I did about 2.5 years of Italian. So I'm fluent there, written and spoken. And I tried to learn French this year, but didn't get too far. So I'll keep working on that one.
I want to ask you a million questions about spearfishing, but I feel like that's maybe outside the scope of this happy hour, but we'll put a pin in that because, okay. Yeah, wow. Everyone contains multitudes. I love it. This is another like toss-up question, whoever wants to jump in here, but can you tell me whether you started covering beer in English first or another language first or both simultaneously, and sort of how do you think that informs the way you think about your work?
I can start. So when I started my project, um, since I was living in the United States, in New York, it was in English. And then a couple of years later, when I went to Costa Rica on that first trip for my project, I saw that there was a huge emerging scene in at least in Central America, Costa Rica. And then when I kept traveling further down South America, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Argentina, and I saw that it was huge. And even before going to those countries, I had a lot of followers that were from Latin America because a lot of them know me and know my background, and they will always comment and ask me like, "Why do you do this in Spanish? Like, you speak Spanish. Why are you in English?" And I had to explain to them because, well, I live in the United States, so that is my primary market. That's where I live, and that's where I'm going to be working for the most part. So, but yeah, it is true that I can. So at some point, I was trying to do that, doing a post in English and Spanish. That was just so much work having to translate that for every single post. And then I just told them, don't be lazy. Instagram translate the shit for you. So just press the button, translate. There you go. But yeah, I get a lot of comments from people. So every now and then, especially if I'm visiting a place that I know that there's a lot of interest in Latin America, I will do it in Spanish, especially if I'm doing reels and stuff. I will speak in Spanish. And even sometimes I will do two. I will do one video in English, one video in Spanish. But it's a lot of work. And when I was in Brazil, I tried to do that in Portuguese, so 3 times, and I was like, yeah, no, I'm not doing this. This is just crazy.
I can go next. Um, in my case, I started posting in Spanish because my page really started as a place to share recipes. And then I went to grad school and I had to write a lot in grad school as one does. And at that point I decided that I really like writing. So I started submitting articles for a consulting company in Canada that deals with beer. So I got published through their website for their customers. It's more like technical brewing writing. So it kind of straddles the lines between copywriting and technical writing. And at that point, I started writing more and more in English, but I decided to keep my channel in Spanish. And at some point, I decided to look into who makes up my audience. And that's where I noticed that about 80% of my audience is between Puerto Rico and the US. So those people are bilingual. So I go back and forward between English and Spanish. I have about 6 or 7 episodes in English out of the 57 that are out there. Actually, the last one was Mandy Naglish that I interviewed 2 weeks ago. So that one's going to come out and it's going to be in English as well. So I keep about a 10% ratio of English content because part of the focus of my podcast is to bring experts to explain things to everybody. So if there is not an expert on that area in Spanish, I have no issues bringing that expert in English. And every single episode, I write an essay that I put on my webpage, and that works as that works as the episode notes. So I will go into detail into the background of the person, the reason why I wrote the episode. If the episode, let's say it's about tasting, then I'll bring up concepts about tasting, translational type of work where a lot of this might not exist in Spanish at all. And I was concerned since the beginning that for one to get exposed to a lot of the good reading material that is technical in nature, you have to be part of some sort of association or society. You have to pay dues. Sometimes for you to learn things, you have to go to conferences, so that's thousands of dollars. And that's why I keep pushing all that content in Spanish so that people can get a little bit of that and then point them to the source if needed.
Very cool. Thanks for that. Anaïs, how about you?
Well, I've always worked in French at first, and then when I got into beer writing, I actually started by writing a book in French that got published last year. And then today I think I mostly write in English rather than in French, but it's not by choice because there's not much opportunity to write about beer in French. So thankfully I can write in English, but up until maybe a year ago, I had never written anything in English. And I was struggling to write for French publication because every French editors I was contacting was rejecting my pitch about beer. They weren't interested about it. And I guess sometimes complaining on Twitter kind of works because I complained about that on Twitter, that I was upset that I was struggling writing about beer because we have, I know that France is not a beer country, but we have a thriving craft beer scene, a rich history, and I wanted to share that. And it's actually Evan from Good Beer Hunting who reached out to me after I complained on Twitter to ask more about that because he knew a bit about France and he was curious that there were not a lot of beer media in France and everything. And then I kind of say, well, if you want, I can maybe write for you for Good Beer Hunting in English, if you're interested. And he said, why not? And I started pitching things, and it's how I started writing in English. My first piece was published, I think, in October last year, so it's really new.
Excellent. Thank you for that. You heard it here first, folks. Complaining on Twitter gets you writing jobs. Beth has a really good question in the chat. Do you prefer writing or speaking about beer in your primary language or in another language? That's an interesting question. I'd be curious to know the answers.
Well, for me, since I got into beer, living in the United States and also working in breweries in New York, I learned all the terminology and everything in English. So I remember especially when I started judging competitions in Latin America, I will always write my everything in English. And if somebody was reading my stuff, they would ask me, say, why are you writing in English? Because I don't know the terms in Spanish. So I also have to start learning the terminology, the very specific things in Spanish. Because sometimes you cannot just do straight translation because it just doesn't make any sense. So after years of, visiting the countries in Latin America and listening to brewers and panelists talking in Spanish, then, okay, that's the word. So now I think I feel a little more comfortable if I have to say something in Spanish. And if I don't know the term, I will just say it in English. And for the most part, people know what I'm talking about.
Can you give an example of like a technical brewing term that you've learned in Spanish recently?
Nothing comes to mind right now. If I remember one, I will
Sure.
share it. But
I'm putting you
there
on
were
the
a bunch.
spot and you're jet lagged, so don't worry about it.
I'll help you out there. Caprylic acid.
Sorry, Christian, say that again.
Caprylic acid.
In
So,
Spanish.
Yeah, well, I'd never heard that word in Spanish. Yeah. And I learned it recently judging the Governor's Cup in New York. And I was like, what do you mean caprylic acid? And there was a brewer there that was trained at, I believe it was New Belgium. So he had quite an extensive sensory training. And he's like, yeah, it's like goat cheese. Like it's goaty. That's caprylic acid. And I was like, well, I don't even know how to say that in Spanish. But I'll put it to my dictionary, and whenever it comes up, I'll say it smells like goats in Spanish.
That's awesome. I've never heard that term either, so we all just learned something. Christian or Anaïs, do you prefer writing and speaking about beer in English, Spanish, or French, or some other Italian? I don't know.
Well, for me, I think, well, I'd love to write more in French about beer, but I think I prefer to write in English because the topic I cover in English are more specific, and I can write longer stories and go more into details and technical stuff. When I write about beer in French, it's mostly it's not about the product or about a brewery, it's more about the culture. For example, I wrote about sexism in the beer industry for French media, or about alcoholism, but I don't write about breweries or French beer history because that's not the topic they're interested in. So in English, I get to go more into that. So that's what I like. And to be honest, I really rather work with American or English editors and French editors. The relation is really different. The editing process, it's really different in French with French people. I guess we don't always have the best reputation, and when I work with French editors, I see that clearly.
Can you say more about that? How are French editors different, or how is the editing process different?
Well, for one thing, let's start at pitching a story. Every time I pitch to an American or English publication, I always get an answer, even if it's a no, but I always get something, a feedback. And I'm really surprised when I get an answer from a French publication. They mostly ignore you, really. 9 times out of 10, I don't get an answer. So just start there. When I pitch to an American publication, even like 2 days after, I get an answer that's like, oh, we've seen your email and we are getting back to you soon with an answer. And then maybe a week or two later, I get an answer. But in French, really, that doesn't ever happen. And when you get a good relationship with an editor in French, you try to keep it because it's quite rare, I think. And then the editing process, from what I've seen while working with you, Kate, for example, or with Evan, is that it's really back and forth process, and editors don't change what I wrote. It's more like, do you think we can change this, or making suggestion. And I've had an experience in French where my story was published and the editors put a lot of own style in the writing. And at the end, it was my signature, but some things, it didn't seem like it was something that I would have wrote myself. So it was kind of upsetting. So yeah, I rather work with English-speaking publication.
I would say I'd rather write about beer in English because that's where I learn my beer language, specifically of flavors and things like that when it comes to judging. Um, and also a lot of the technical terms are there. So I have about a year of experience working in a full-on Spanish environment, but I have 13 years of experience working in English environments. So some of the production terms, some of the terms that might be industry or supply chain specific, I have those in my mind in English. So I feel a lot more fluent covering the industry itself in English. And in fact, I sometimes struggle to put them in Spanish in my writings for my listeners. So I have to sometimes put them in parentheses what the term in English is, or I just put them in italics and put the term in another language and just keep rolling with it.
Can you give an example of like a term that you've struggled to find a Spanish counterpart for?
Lautering. There's no term for lautering. It's people might use filtering instead of lautering. There's no term for brewing in Spanish. So people say brewing in English, right? Or they would say cocinar as in cooking beer. Or some people in Puerto Rico use an anglicized term, which is bruciar. So it's like taking the word brew and make it into a verb in Spanish.
That's cool. Language is so flexible. That's really cool. Tara, do you want to unmute yourself and ask one or more of your 5 questions? Please jump in.
Sure. Hi. I'll ask one that is for all 3 of you and segues nicely from what we were talking about vis-a-vis editors. First of all, congratulations to you getting so many responses from editors. You must have some magic touch. I don't get that kind of response or know anybody else who does. So for those who are pitching stories about culture, not just beer, but having to do something with being female or not being American, by origin. Who besides GBH likes those stories, and what sorts of stories are they interested in publishing these days? Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks for that, Tara. Anyone want to jump in here?
I would say that I've gotten more requests to write about diversity than I have gotten requests to write about beer. So,
Hi.
I mean, sometimes it becomes a little bit cliche because you're just asked to be the diverse voice in diversity. But at the same time, I think it's important because it's just a different perspective and it gives you the opportunity to show your perspective to people.
I can't really answer that because I'm not a writer. I've never considered myself a writer. I'm a photographer first. I do write, but for me, and like for my posts and for my stories, I did a little bit of work in the past. I think that's probably one of the first writing jobs I did, and I see that he's logged in. The prestigious Jimmy Carbone, when he was doing his show, the Beer Sessions Radio on the Road. I was hired as a photographer and as a writer, so I wrote some pieces there. But I can't really, relate to what Christian and Anaïs are saying. And when I did try, that I wanted to write something, especially in Spanish. I remember this was years ago, having these conversations with Michael Kaiser, saying, you guys have no idea pretty much what's happening in Latin America because, a lot of people have not gone there, and you get stories, you get pitch stories, but, you haven't been there. And it's a different thing when you're at the place, speaking to the people and learning from them directly, and, their struggles, their triumphs, everything is very different than somebody just pitching a story to you. So I did have some conversations with him, But at the end, for me, it was not worth it, just because, the pay wasn't what I needed. And it was just going to be an extra layer of what I was already doing, which was, telling the stories with pictures. And then a few years later, that did happen. Now they kind of like did the transition, translating some of the articles. And I actually met one of the guys who's doing that, Paul Sandoval. He's also from Venezuela. We met in Argentina. So I thought they had that covered. But if anytime I ever decide to do that, is going to be like on my own website, and just have like a section there for like blogging, where I can be my own editor. Because again, that's the other thing, that since I'm not a writer, the few times that I pitch something to an editor, they just massacre my whatever is it that I wrote. And then after that, I was like, you know what, that's fine, but this is my voice, and this is how I'm going to tell it, even though I'm not a writer, and I'm going to have some mistakes. But especially people who don't speak English, when they read that, they can relate. They can relate to my mistakes. They can relate to how I'm trying to portray a story, because I'm thinking in Spanish but writing it in English, and things like that. There's like very little things. So yeah, that's my 2 cents on that.
Cool. Tara, do you have other questions?
Yeah. So is there enough of these are more for Christian and Miguel? Is there enough of a Hispanic presence in beer would you foresee in the next few years there being a similar group forming, like the Black Brewers Association, for instance? Is there as more people from diverse backgrounds enter beer in the States, are you all finding each other talking about any kind of organization? I'll ask one at a time, I guess. That way you can cut me off when you're bored.
There is a huge presence, huge, gigantic presence of Latin American breweries. But that being said, there is still the lack of confidence. And then again, this is a cultural thing. And Tara, you said, if you know Spanish and you know a little about the culture, then you know that that's just a cultural thing, where as Latin American, we feel like, we always have to look up to the United States, for example, for anything, when it comes to innovation and, trends and everything, everybody's looking to the United States. So they have that lack of confidence. And I remember the last time I was in Costa Rica, I was there with Peter Bucart, who's a very renowned brewer. And he gave this talk. We're all doing, it was a panel, and we were all talking about our areas. And I think I've been saying this for 8 years now, every time I go there, but Peter is Peter. So everybody was going to listen to him, not to me. And he said it, he summarized it perfectly. And what he said is, why are you making all these styles of beer here in Latin America? Like, why are you making hazy IPAs? Why are you making a double or a triple Belgian beer? Like, that's already been done. I already made that in Belgium. IPAs, hazy IPAs, already been done in the United States. So why are you making that? Why don't you focus on the things that are native to you, like your own ingredients? And that's the only way that, you're gonna showcase what you have, not repeating what's already been done. So he said, I challenge you. I want to come here in 10 years and I want to be blown away. And he dropped the mic, literally. He dropped the mic. I think I still have that video of him saying that. And I've been saying that for the last 8 years. Every time I go to Latin America, I tell them, I don't need to I just went to Brazil, for example. And I don't need to come to Brazil and have a hazy IPA. Number one, I don't like that kind of beer. I never liked them. But I have met some brewers and breweries in Ecuador, Christian knows them as well, that are making chicha, beer with corn. The same process that the Belgians do to making a lambic, we're doing it with corn. And they are spectacular, spectacular beers. But for them, they don't have the confidence enough. So I always tell them that that's the only way that we are going to be able to sit down with the North Americans and with the Europeans when we sit down at a table and be like, all right, this is the beer we're making with corn, with yuca, and very endemic ingredients. But until that uh, mentality and the confidence is there, it's gonna be a while.
I would say my experience has been that there is lately a lot more organization among Spanish speaking or Hispanic origin brewers and breweries. There are a lot of brewers that work in breweries that are Hispanic, but the owners are not necessarily. And it comes because of different reasons. One of them might be access to capital, financial literacy opportunities, etc. But also, like what Miguel said, it's um, there's also a mentality that you're coming here to another country, so like you're not necessarily the owner of anything, you're just participating in the economy. But I would say this year there was actually a festival that was put together that was all Hispanic breweries only. I believe that happened in Colorado, but I may be wrong. And so we're seeing more and more grouping and organization of Spanish speaking people or Spanish speaking brewers, um, bring that up to the main um, front row as a pure event, not necessarily as what we call, like, I don't know, at work they say that I have a Puerto Rican mafia. So like the Puerto Rican mafia exists, like we know each other. When I interview Miguel in my podcast, Miguel gave me a list of people that I should interview, and I'm still super thankful for that to this day because it expanded my network, and now I know them, and then they can connect me to someone else, right? So the organization exists, but as a group per se, no, it doesn't exist. Will it be created? I don't know. There has to be a quantifiable benefit to it.
I'm gonna add this because this was maybe 2018, I think. There was this organization that was called Bloque Cervecero de Latinoamérica. So it was like the Latin American bloc. That was kind of like the translation. So it was basically all the brewers associations of every country, they got together, Latin American, they got together. So in paper, the idea was pretty good. But then I think I was there in 2019, happened in Panama. It was like the second edition. And they got together. And I remember it was all the smaller countries, at least beer wise. And then came Mexico and Brazil. And, they came in trying to just smash everybody down because they are the biggest in terms of, quantity, quality in the region. And whoever was the head of that organization told him, no, you cannot just come here. We're inviting you to come and see, but you cannot come here barking orders and you're not even a member. That's not how it works. Um, and I remember because I speak Spanish, I was listening to everything, even though I was just there taking pictures, but I was listening to everything they were saying. And then that just kind of went away because again, every country in Latin America it's a different country, so they have different laws and different regulations. So it's very hard for them to get together as a bloc to make things happen for everybody because it's not like a one size fits all. That's not how it works. It's very different. Each country has their own idiosyncrasies and things happening in politics as well. So again, it was a very nice idea. It was a very nice thought, but it didn't go from three meetings. I hope that they can find some common ground, but at the end of the day, whoever has the capital is the one who's going to have access to the better ingredients, to the malts, to the hops. And the people, the smaller breweries who don't have access to that, they're going to keep getting whatever is left in the bottom of the barrel.
Yeah, thanks for that, guys. A question that I have, and I welcome other people to jump in here too, but when you were talking about, getting recommendations from each other, what beer podcasts do you listen to? What beer people do you follow on social media, or what beer media do you read in non-English that the rest of us should be checking out? What are some recommendations that you would give to the group here?
I won't be of much help because in French media about beer, I can't really recommend one. I can recommend people that are doing newsletter in French that are really interesting. There's Juliette Fiong, who has a newsletter that's called Pimpins, and it's about, she's really, you learn something about beer without realizing it at the end of the newsletter, because it's funny and it's a funny way to learn things. She writes from a personal point of view, and I really like her writing style. But yeah, we really like French beer media at the moment. There's some, but I can't really recommend them.
I see a podcast once in a while. It's like a video, an audio podcast called El Sentido de la Birra, the sense of beer. It's sponsored by a big, I believe it's a Spanish brewing company. So the podcast doesn't necessarily have a lot to do with beer, but they're having a beer and having a conversation, and it's quite engaging. There's one called Gastropolitica. That's from, I might be wrong, but it might be Argentina, and it's intense. It's charged with history. It's charged with real information about politics and anything that has to do with food. It's like mixed together. There's a lot of research in each episode, and they're rather short.
That sounds.
For wine, there's this person called Leonor Sosa. She's an educator. She's right now out of Chile, and she has a lot of good content on wine as well. She teaches classes about wine. So I really straddled the line between beer, wine, and food. So my sources are a little bit all over the place. And then for technical stuff, I go full on English, and I, get it from the source, like MBAA, things like that.
Miguel, any recommendations for us that people might not already be following or listening to or reading?
Well, the thing is that I get, like, my sources are mostly straight from the source, like from the brewer. So if it comes in terms of like a podcast or publication, not really. The only one I can think of that there's some different writers that come in as guests. It's called Con Espuma. I think it's from Chile. So they do a lot of like articles, and people write like pieces. So that's the only one that comes to mind right now. And podcasts, there's very little. Like there's this guys in Ecuador from a brewery called Andes Brewing, and he started doing this like podcast slash blogcast with videos. It was very interesting, but it was very super local. It was a lot of like Ecuadorian breweries and what's happening in Ecuador. But I don't know if they have done any more episodes. So yeah, those are the ones that come to mind right now.
Cool, thanks guys. With about 10 minutes left, I want to open this up to anybody else who might have some questions Otherwise, I have plenty more, but want to give people a chance to jump in too. Feel free to unmute here. But I guess a question that I wanted to really ask is what are the opportunities you feel like you've had professionally that you would not, I don't know, that you would not have otherwise had if you didn't speak multiple languages, and have any of those opportunities kind of surprised you? Has your ability to speak multiple languages opened doors that you didn't anticipate?
I was at CBC last year, and Miguel was there, and Miguel was talking to someone who was talking with an Italian accent, so we ended up talking in Italian, and it ended up being Huasca, the guy that designed that beer glass, the Teku glass. So
That's so cool.
Yeah.
I didn't even, I guess I never thought about who had designed it, and I didn't know that that person was Italian, but now that explains why that glass is so like elegant. I guess that's really cool.
I will share in the first year that I went to, no, not the first year, I think it was last year. Last year or the year before, I can't remember, but Yakima, covering hop harvest. And I had been to Yakima, my first time was in 2019. I went with a local brewery from New York. They wanted to go harvest, check their hops, and they asked me if I wanted to come because he said, you know, I don't want to be taking pictures with my phone. I'd rather have some good content. So do you want to come? And I said, absolutely. So I went on that trip, and I actually met a lot of the families from, you know, Carpenter's Ranch, CLS, John Siegel. So I met a lot of the families and started, you know, continuing cultivating the relationships the way that I've been doing it for the last 10 years. And then I think the following year, one of the owners from CLS, she reached out to me and she asked me, it's like, hey, you know, we met last year when you came with such and such brewery, and we love, you know, the way that you were taking pictures, and would you like to come and do that for us? And I was like, absolutely. So I went there, and she said, well, I want you to document this, and, you know, do what you do and just document, because we don't usually get that. So I went there for a week, and they just gave me a camper, and they put me in the middle of the hop fields, and that was amazing. And Shelly is her name, Shelly DeMarais. She said, you have complete access to everything, 24 hours, whatever you want to do, you have access. You just do what you do. So she already gave me permission. So I took her word. And I remember one night I woke up like at 2 o'clock in the morning, and I don't know if I was jet lag or not something, but I woke up and everybody's sleeping. You know, everybody who's not working, because over there on the farm, everybody's working 24/7. So I just started walking towards where where the trucks come and they, you know, dismount all the hops. And all the people who work there, they are from Central America or Mexico, and they speak Spanish. So usually, for the most part, when people see me, especially when I have the long beard and all that, I don't look Hispanic at all. So the last thing they will expect is me start speaking Spanish. So I walk up to some of these people and started speaking Spanish to them, and you could see them all cracking up and looking at me and making jokes, which I could understand, but that was another thing. And I started talking to one of them, and then I asked him, where are you going now? He said, well, I'm just finishing unloading this truck, and then I have to go back to the hop field. Do you want to come? And I'm like, oh, it's 2:30 in the morning. I'm not sleepy. Okay, just give me a second. So I went running back to the trailer, got my camera, jumped in the truck with him, and we left. And I said, how long is this trip? He said, well, it's like 45 minutes one way, and then whatever amount of time we load the truck, and then 45 minutes back. I'm like, okay. So I jump in the truck with him, start talking. And when we get there, there's no lights. It's in the middle of nowhere, no lights. The only lights that you have was the truck that was arriving and the tractor who's like cutting. So I jump off the truck and I'm gonna start taking some pictures. And as soon as the truck finished loading, he left and the tractor was turning away and it turned pitch black. And I'm like there in the middle of the hop field with no lights, no nothing, just my camera. And then the only thing I see is when the other truck is coming, and I just saw the lights, and I have to jump, literally jump out of the way to not get run over. And the guy who took me in the truck, he saw me, so he came back and he said, "Oh yeah, by the way, you have to be careful because nobody's expecting anyone to be here taking pictures. So yeah, you have to be careful." I'm like, "Okay, thank you." And I jumped back in the truck with him, and we went back. And on my way, I started recording the guy in our conversation, and I posted all this in stories. So I go back to sleep, and we got back probably like at 4 in the morning. I went back to sleep. 8 in the morning, I wake up, go into the office, and I'm having my coffee. And Shelly walks in, and she's like, "So, I saw you went on the trucks last night or this morning." And I said, I did because you told me I can do whatever I wanted. And she said, no, I know. But I always tell people that this is something that they have to experience and nobody does it, either because they're scared or they don't have the time. And you did it. So you're family now. And I was like, wow, okay. So that was a pretty cool moment.
That's an amazing story. I'm glad it ended so well and not with you getting run over by a hop truck in the middle of the night. That would have been tragic. Glad you made it. Anaïs, does anything come to mind for you?
Well, just that maybe if I only knew French and I didn't know how to write in English, I think I would have gave up beer writing by now. So yeah, it really helped that I'm able to do that, and also it feels less lonely because there's the guild, well, things like that, and the British Guild as well. Last week I was actually in London for the award ceremony from the British Guild, and just it was the first time that I was able to meet other beer writers like that. So talking about that and with people that understand the struggle and what you do, and it's really cool, and I've never had that before, and there's not much of beer writing in France, so sometimes it feels quite lonely. So to be able by speaking English to enter this kind of groups, it's actually really cool, and it helps a lot because when you're freelancing, well, everyone knows that it's difficult and sometimes it feels lonely, and when you're alone in a country when no one else does what you do, it feels lonely. So now I don't feel quite so lonely.
Ah, that's so great. Well, thank you. I think that's a lovely place to end it on such a like sweet and positive note. Thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you to our panelists for joining us. This was so cool. I learned so much, and I'm really grateful for all of you taking time to do this. It's really appreciated, and I think everyone here learned a lot. So thank you so much. I will let's see. I will stop our recording. And yeah, thank you all for being here.